collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up on the programme this week, the pimping of prostitution. We talk to journalist, broadcaster and author Julie Bindel.
Clearly, we can argue convincingly that prostitution should be considered an ancient relic. Women shouldn't have to rent the insides of their bodies for one-sided sexual pleasure for men.
And the EU's Commissioner for Humanitarian Affairs tells us about the dire problems facing the Rohingya in Bangladesh.
I visited Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh in October, November. I met a lot of people from the Rohingya community and I heard a lot of painful description about the situation on the ground. This is why at that time I agreed with Secretary General Antonio Guterres that the situation on the ground is very close what I can characterize as genocide.
The Easter holidays are coming up and the Artos Foundation is running another kids' university.
We'll do anything from creative writing, so they will learn how to express themselves in writing. So this is something which is very important for the kids, that they go into the shortcuts and all these things, that they can manage to express themselves and be creative in writing as well. We'll have a chance to deal with geomagnetics and how to protect them from electromagnetics, from their computer, from their mobile, from the router in the house, and all these things.
Investigative journalist and author Julie Bindel was in Nicosia last week for an evening at which she spoke about her book, The Pimping of Prostitution, and very generally too about the sex trade, violence against women and trafficking. They're all issues that she has investigated over many years in her career, and she took questions as well afterwards. When I spoke to her, she told me about the evening and how she'd come to be in Cyprus.
I was invited to Cyprus because obviously many of the feminist groups here are concerned about trafficking into the sex trade and about the sex trade in general, because it is, of course, a cause and a consequence of women's oppression, and yet so misunderstood by so many citizens who think the women are choosing it or they're happy within their so-called work and that unionisation or labour rights would help. So I covered all of those issues, but in the main, I was looking at the reasons why, I suppose, I decided to do this research and produce a book out of the work I've been doing for a couple of decades, which is to ask the question, why is it that when you ask people who know nothing about the sex trade, they're not involved in any way, and this can be people from every walk of life in every country around the world, when you ask them what should we do about the problems inherent to prostitution, they will usually say, legalise it, make it safer for the women. And, Holland, for example, which I've just come back from a trip from, and Germany and some states in Australia and New Zealand.
Well, they have legalised it,
They have all actually tried this. With New Zealand, it's decriminalisation, but it's a very close cousin of legalisation, and it's been an unmitigated disaster, and you can spin it how you like, but the reasons why these countries did legalise their sex trades or legitimise them through decriminalisation was, at the time they said, and I think quite genuinely, it will stop trafficking, it will reduce violence, it will mean better health care for the women, and actually the opposite has happened. Of course, legalisation and legal brothels and a complete cultural normalisation of paying for sex has meant that the supply is brought in from other countries to meet the growing demand. Because, for example, if you have a McDonald's at the end of your street, you're more likely to eat McDonald's than you would if you had to walk or drive 3 miles for one. So many men just think, I may as well try it, it's not against the law. So trafficking has increased, the demand has increased, and the illegitimate brothel trade and street trade has grown, because legalisation is a mask for the illicit, unlicensed premises, and abuse is happening in all of them.
So what is the answer? Because there are alternatives and they've proved to be relatively successful.
Well, during the research for my book, I visited between 35 and 40 countries, cities, states, even a village in India where prostitution had been the main source of income for the pimps, and the girls had been prostituted from a young age. So I did 250 interviews and very extensive research. And I found that those who argue for legalisation really know very little about what legalisation is. And similarly, they know very little about the alternative model that I support, which is known as the Nordic model, or the abolitionist model, because it's now spread its tentacles in countries such as Ireland and France, which is where you decriminalise the women and men selling sex, which is right and proper, because why should you criminalise abuse and poverty? But you criminalise those who buy sex, which is the men who create the demand, and offers exiting services for those who wish to get out of the sex trade. But alongside that, the governments that brought in this legislation, which is now active in Sweden, Norway, Finland, as I say, the Republic of Ireland, the north of Ireland, and France, the governments educate the public about why this law is necessary. They see it as part of their human rights, violence against women legislation. They explain in their public education that this isn't an anti-sex moralist position. This is something that is a progressive law, because it thinks clearly, we can argue convincingly that prostitution should be considered an ancient relic. Women shouldn't have to rent the insides of their bodies for one-sided sexual pleasure for men. We shouldn't be looking at this as an alternative to earning a living in other areas. So I think that alternative is the best one, because legalisation has failed. The Nordic law and model has been successful in reducing trafficking, reducing numbers of women in the sex trade, and reducing the violence. For example, there has been only one murder, which is one murder too many, in all of the countries put together that have introduced the Nordic model, whereas in the Netherlands and Germany there have been scores of murders of prostituted women by pimps and punters.
Yeah, and the Nordic model, there are statistics out there showing that it has cut the demand quite dramatically, and that surely is the essence of where future success lies.
You're absolutely right. In the countries that have adopted the Nordic model, demand has dramatically decreased. It's not true that it has just gone underground. Prostitution can never go underground, because the pimps and the women themselves advertise, and the men have to be able to find it. So it's nonsense that it causes danger for the women, because if a sex buyer turns up at a woman's apartment and he demands sex without a condom, or is even rude to her, she can just pick up the phone and report him. He's already committed a crime before any other act of violence. So the pro-prostitution, pro-legalisation lobbyists will say it hasn't reduced demand, it's gone underground, the women are in danger. This isn't the case. It's not perfect. But what else are we going to do? We have to make an attempt to recognise that the sex trade is populated by desperate, disenfranchised women, disproportionately black women, women of colour, indigenous women, women whose childhood was blighted by sexual abuse and marginalisation.
Or women who've been tricked into travelling for what they thought was a totally different job, and then once they're in the country that they've been trafficked to, they suddenly find that this wasn't part of the deal, but that's how it's going to be.
That's right, and Cyprus is known as a destination and a transit country for trafficking. Obviously, there have been problems with Filipino women being brought into the country in exactly the way that you've described. Not forced, not handcuffed, no gun to the head, but brought in with the expectation that they will be cleaning in hotels, for example, and end up being trapped in the sex trade and abused within it.
Tell us about the book, because it's readily available and the culmination of many years of research, as you said. So where can people find out more, get a copy of the book?
Well, the book is entitled The Pimping of Prostitution, Abolishing the Sex Work Myth. And I called it The Pimping of Prostitution because it's now common parlance that you pimp your coffee, you pimp your ride. In other words, you glamorise it, you make it better in some way, and prostitution has been presented as something rather more glamorous than it is. You can buy it on Amazon, you can buy it through the publishers Palgrave Macmillan.
Investigative journalist Julie Bindel, who was talking in Nicosia last week.
In collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
The biggest achievement of Crime Stoppers has been the ability of the public to be able to give information about crime anonymously.
There's no way I could have kept prostituting without the drugs. There's no way I could have had my body used like a public toilet, because that's actually what prostitution is.
And then the fourth series I started 3 days after I'd won the Oscar, so the whole of the Monarch of the Glen experience was all interplatted with the Gosford Park Oscar experience.
I was working with Ronnie James Dio, and David was going to reform Whitesnake in 2003.
Cyprus was chosen because Cyprus is a stable, peaceful and secure place.
We have to really look closely. What are we doing with children? What are we doing with adolescents? And what are we doing with adults that can help them move into a more literate situation?
The ones that I'm proudest of are the ones that were true discoveries, where we found something we didn't know existed.
I think we've probably all heard about and seen the dreadful pictures that have come from Bangladesh and show the plight of the Rohingya who have fled from Myanmar. Well, the EU Humanitarian Commissioner is Cypriot Christos Stylianidis, and when he was in Nicosia recently, I met up with him. He's quite recently been to visit Bangladesh and see exactly what the EU can do, and I asked him to tell us about the conditions there, and indeed, what could the EU do to help.
Firstly, I take this opportunity to say that as Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Management, I realized a year ago that the situation in Rakhine State was completely volatile, and definitely the situation against Rohingya's community day by day was getting worse. And I decided to visit Rakhine State, and in June last year I was the first European official to visit this area, because I would like to assess the situation on the ground and, frankly speaking, to discuss in a very tough way with my dear interlocutors, Myanmar authorities, and to more or less persuade them to see how to deal with this unacceptable situation.
But what did you find on the ground? We've heard UN officials describe it as genocide. Now, what did you see when you went there?
When I visited in June, frankly speaking, the situation more or less is not something very serious about Rohingya community. But all information after my visit from our humanitarian partners on the ground, unfortunately, they insisted on this. The authorities, and especially the regional authorities, they wanted to put pressure on the Rohingya community to leave from their villages.
But we heard about villages burnt to the ground, yes, about rapes, about murders. Is there any evidence from your people on the ground or what you saw that this happened?
Look, when also I visited Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh in October, November, I met a lot of people from Rohingya community, and I heard a lot of painful description about the situation on the ground, and this is why At that time, I agreed with Secretary General Antonio Guterres that the situation on the ground is very close what I can characterize as genocide.
Right. What can the EU do? You're the Humanitarian Commissioner, and funds, I guess, are limited, but you're talking about literally millions of displaced people crammed into a very small area. Many of them are children, many are orphans because their parents have died in those fires and the razing of the villages. What on earth? Where do you start?
I have to say, and this is why I strongly believe that as EU citizen, I feel proud because in a pledge conference in Geneva, again, European Union as a whole was the biggest donor. The first one. Second one, definitely we have to continue our advocacy to raise awareness about the situation, not only in Cox's Bazar, but also inside Myanmar.
Well, let's talk about that briefly, because we've just had news that one of the major players has withdrawn from any contact with the authorities in Myanmar. And I wonder where that leaves the rest of the world who would like to find a solution, because Aung San Suu Kyi is now being accused of not being really behind efforts to bring some sort of justice to the Rohingya people.
3 points about your remarks, because I agree that, first of all, we have to insist and to make a lot of efforts in order to avoid to see Rohingya crisis as a forgotten crisis. First point. Second point, there is a small hope. We saw this agreement between Bangladesh government and Myanmar about the repatriation of some of Rohingyas.
Before you go on, can I ask you whether or not that was even on the cards when you visited, and would they go back if there are no security assurances? Because what would they go back to?
Definitely for us, there is no any support for this process, this procedure, without 3 preconditions. Firstly, voluntary base of any repatriation process. Secondly, this process has to provide to community, Rohingya community, all aspects of this process in dignified manner, and at the same time completely voluntarily.
And secure.
And of course, above all, the security in their villages is not only a precondition, but is something as a starting point for any discussion.
Do you think that can be achieved? Are the Myanmar authorities even thinking that they can guarantee that?
We follow the situation. Until now, we didn't make our assessment because it's ongoing process. But for us, security, dignified manner, voluntarily, and of course, definitely respect of human rights of this community are the only way in order to accept any discussion about repatriation process.
One final question for you.
Because I would like to insist on what you already said about the problem of the children. I have an obsession, I think good obsession, about education in emergencies. And I saw there an incredible situation. We realized in our visit in Cox's Bazar that 62% of the whole population of the camp were children. Unbelievable. And this is why we focus on education in order to avoid radicalization, forced recruitment, forced marriage, and forced labor. So, of course, we have to deal with all aspects of this crisis, but For me, top priority remains education and protection for these children.
And health, of course, because there have been, obviously, in such crowded places, terrible health dangers, and we've seen European doctors going out there to try and contain things so there isn't an epidemic.
I can promise, as Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid, that we will continue our contribution, our assistance there, as long as it takes, and definitely with not only humanitarian approach, but also political commitment that we have to persuade Myanmar authorities that the only way is to accept the human rights of the Rohingya community.
The European Commissioner for Humanitarian Affairs, Christos Stylianidis, talking to me recently when we met up in Nicosia.
In collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
And in other news in Cyprus this week, well, the standoff in the island's exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, with Turkish warships claiming another Navtex and keeping the Eni drill ship immobilised some 50 kilometres from where it would like to be. Time is running out because it has to go somewhere else at the beginning of March, and the war of words continues, with the government of Cyprus saying that it's using all diplomatic means, and Turkey saying that the answer lies in the solution to the Cyprus problem. And flash floods hit Limassol last weekend, with pictures of cars absolutely stranded up to their windows in floodwater along the coastal area of Limassol. There were reports too that customers at some of the restaurants in the popular Old Port area were obliged, because of the torrents racing through the restaurants, to stand on chairs and tables to escape the floods. The cost has yet to be calculated, but it runs into millions of euros.
Listen online to the Cyprus News Digest on YouTube or at cyprusmail.libsyn.com. The latest program is uploaded every Friday, and if you missed one, you can catch up there.
I don't think most parents need telling that the spring holidays for Easter are coming up, and what to do with the kids. They get bored so easily these days. That is, unless they attend something like the Artos Foundation Kids University. It's something that's been going on for many years now, and there's one coming back this spring. Achilleas Kendonis from the Artos Foundation is here to tell us more. Achilleas, it's called Earth, and it's part, I think, of what you called back to basics, bird's eye view of the world. What does that mean?
Actually, since it's spring and nature is coming back to life again, we use it as another renaissance or another regeneration of the planet. So we go back to basics, because every birth starts with the basics. And now that we live in the techno world, we lose the element of communicating with our ecosystem. And of course in the ecosystem is also the human beings and the animals and the plants as well. But we need to be able to digest and understand nature and feel the secrets of nature that are related to us. That's why when we say have the bird's eye view, it's because we see it from high above and we see all these things, and then you can go right to the point and see all the elements of life, starting from how our body interacts with the planet Earth through geomagnetism. Because geomagnetism is something that influences our way of thinking, our mood, and many other things.
So it's an umbrella term, but there's a lot of different aspects to what you do during the university. So how long does it last? And tell us about some of the projects within it.
It lasts, for April, it's going to be for 4 days, from Monday until Thursday. And within these 4 days, which is bilingual, it's Greek and English, and we have specialized personnel for that they are trained, educators for that. We'll do anything from creative writing, so they will learn how to express themselves in writing. So it's something which is very important for the kids, that they go into the shortcuts and all these things, that they can manage to express themselves and be creative in writing as well. We will have a chance to deal with the geomagnetics and how to protect them from electromagnetics, from their computer, from their mobile, from the router in the house, and all these things. And of course will be a series of other actions that will engage their hands, their brain, and we always use to touch both sides of the brain. The creative one, that we say, forget about logic now, imagine. Listen to yourself, design what you want, and then we leave the dream aside, and then we go into implementation. Because in Cyprus, I believe in the Mediterranean in general, we have wonderful ideas, but we never implement because we don't know how to implement, or we get the satisfaction only by thinking about it, by imagining it. It's good enough, and we stop there. This is not how we can bring things further. We have to learn how to implement our dreams, because then we get our satisfaction. That's why we touch both sides of the brain.
I'm interested that one of the things that's down on the list that I read is the creation of a vertical garden and clever watering systems.
Yes, because not everybody has the luxury to have a backyard. We'll teach them how to create a vertical gardening on a wall, and also can use some very basic, not technology actually, it's like a hacking device. Through renewable materials, they can learn how they can water this, even if you are not at home, how you can water this vertical garden, so you can have your fresh fruits and fresh herbs and salads and things like that, which is very important. It's very good. It's very important, I think, for the young generation to understand it's not about taking care of their iPad, but also they can take care of something that grows. Somebody can see it from little going up.
And particularly important for children who live in blocks of flats, for example,
yes,
who maybe don't have the luxury, as you said, of a garden, or have to go to a public park to enjoy communing with nature.
Yes, but even the ones that they have, a backyard or something like that, they can still come up with ideas, bring these ideas to school, they can set this at school, so they can... It's about sustainability, I think. We have to learn how we can free ourselves from the rest of the world that is really pushing us to dead ends.
Well, there are no dead ends, definitely, in the Kids University. If you want to know more, look up the Artos Foundation's website or get in touch with them. And Achilles, how do people book? It is, I think, something that a lot of kids come with their brothers and sisters, and you have
yes,
special rates for siblings. But we should emphasise this is the 2nd to the 5th of April, so it's Easter week for the Orthodox.
Yes, that's correct. And they can register by giving us a call. The number is 2244-5456, or send us an email on info@artosfoundation.org.
And look up the Artos Foundation on Facebook and online. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.